Welcome to the Decolonising Education YouTube channel. Today I'm talking to Michael, Kay and Shona about what it means to do decolonising work as individuals who are racialised as white and working within the education system. Before we start, I just want to ask you to introduce yourselves. Shona, do you want to go first?
Okay, so I'm Shona Hunter. I do lots of different things. I suppose my key role at the moment is being based in the Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University. I don't know how much you want actually, Muna. I have been running an initiative called White Spaces for about 12 or so years, and thinking through kind of ideas of whiteness for a lot longer than that. But I think, do you need any more than that?
No, that's perfect, thank you.
Okay, so.
Kay?
Yeah, so I work with Shona. I'm also based at Leeds Beckett. I'm a lecturer in education and childhood there. Been there about 18 months now, and I suppose my journey really kind of started. I used to teach on a PGCE at Northern College, which was a quite unusual PGCE. It was a social justice education course, and so I think a lot of my thinking sort of emerged from being in that space, thinking about social justice within education, and I carried that sort of through the roles that I've had since then. So I was previously at Leeds University before I came to Beckett.
Brilliant. Michael?
Hi, so yeah, I'm Michael. I've been involved in academia for about 20 years, but at the same time as working as a sports therapist. So I've been involved in healthcare and education, and in the last kind of decade in higher education. So mostly teach sports therapy, but in the last 10, 15 years have been looking at social justice issues in education, and currently partway through a PhD using critical whiteness studies to look at the kind of role of white allies, accomplices, activists in education.
Brilliant, thank you. So just to start us off, what was your initial introduction to doing this work? So what got you started on doing anti-racist decolonising work within your practice?
You
want to go, Shona?
Let's start.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, this is really interesting. So I started, I think, to become explicitly aware of whiteness and my own kind of position as somebody who's racialised as white when I was doing my kind of undergraduate degree. I think my understanding of kind of being racialised probably crept in at different points in my life before that, but being able to kind of articulate it started at the point of my undergraduate work. And I think it's interesting, I was listening to Kay and I was listening to Michael there, and of course we've got those connections in our trajectories in some ways. So Michael, I think, knows Gargi Bhattacharya now, and Gargi, I can remember Gargi's lecture, one of my first undergraduate lectures with Gargi Bhattacharya at CS 1D. We don't have any such kind of codes for, it was Cultural Studies Double 1. So we used to have like these double modules, we used to call them then. And yeah, so it was, I think, as part of that learning as an undergraduate, but I think on a personal level, and this kind of relates to how I think about whiteness as a kind of racial formation and as something that's lived. I think it was my interest in power and institutionalized power, and the questions about where I sat within institutionalized power dynamics that really started me kind of thinking about what it meant to be white. So there was a lot of stuff around gender that as a young kind of white woman I'd been kind of exposed to, lots of stuff around class, that sort of stuff in all sorts of ways. And I'd been doing a lot of work on race. So I suppose I would have positioned myself at the time as somebody who was anti-racist, or I was starting to come to that kind of positioning, that understanding again. But I was just really interested in why I was always learning about other people's position as racialised. And I was kind of interested in what that meant, really. And then being schooled at least in part by Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at that time. So Gargi Bhattacharya was there, David Parker was there, Malika Medid was also really important in my kind of learning at that time. So so that's kind of where I started off. And there's lots of aspects around the lived realities of that, but I'll leave it at that. That's kind of the beginnings. And I think just to say a final thing, because I do think this is important to how I approach these issues. I didn't start, so my understandings around race, racialisation, gendering, cultural relations of power were tools already that I was using to understand politics and political analysis, because that's kind of where I started off. I started off in social policy and actually stayed in all sorts of guises there, and still now work in that area. But that's really important, and maybe that will come out as we kind of talk, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Kay, what about you? You said that you were introduced to this part of when you were doing the PEGCE teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really key moment for me. And interestingly, before I taught on that particular PGCE, I did the PGCE there myself at Northern College. So I was introduced to writers like Bell Hooks, who I think that was one of those kind of blinding moments when you read someone's work and you think, hang on a minute, my background, very sort of white privileged upbringing, and I haven't always lived in Leeds. I grew up on the south coast, so very sort of limited experience, I think, going back. I suppose another kind of key, kind of critical moment for me, a big part of my career was spent in local government. And for about 10, 15 years, my role was quite an interesting one. I was the training officer for the council's elected members, so for the politicians. So I was thrown into a very sort of politicised space, and a space where I learned and got exposed to a lot of, I guess, policy and sort of factual information about injustice, particularly within Leeds as a city, and also saw the kind of machinations of politics and the real systemic kind of inequalities laid bare. So that caused a lot of conflict for me, particularly working with the kind of leaders that were in power at the time as well, and seeing how that played out. So I suppose I had a sort of growing sense of kind of anger and injustice that then led me into more of a sort of teaching role and doing my own PGC and then teaching, a bit further down the line, teaching on that. But I think it was the voices of thinkers, I think, that really spoke to me and made me question myself a lot, because the course itself is very much a reflective programme. So you have to really examine your own position, your own upbringing, your own experience, and start from that place. And I think that's what kind of got me into a mindset to actually think, hang on a minute, I've never even thought about whiteness before. I haven't thought about power in that way before. And then once I was kind of on that trajectory, I couldn't, there was no getting off that. So yeah, that's how I kind of came to this position, I think.
And Michael?
Yeah, mine's probably a little bit more long-winded in that I think from a very early age, I had a strong concept of kind of the oppressive force of gender and class, because I lived primarily with my sisters and my mum, and there were things I remember wanting to do as a boy, but that were gendered in such a way that I felt like I couldn't do them. And I went to a fee-paying school, but on an assisted place. So I was very much one of the kind of, poorer pupils at a rich school. So I could see this divide in class. But I grew up in a very, very white setting. So race was never something that was at the forefront of my mind as a kid, because I never really saw it. But I kind of, into my teens, I started to gather that there were these different ways society had constructed things that were causing unfair or disproportionate kind of experiences for people. And kind of going into my mid-20s and moving into, I worked in professional sport for a bit. I worked in further education at a college in London. I'm now at a post-92 London university, where the students and the staff were more diverse than I'd ever experienced before. And I began to see things like this kind of obsession with student deficit. So what have we got to fix about these students because they're not matching these kind of socially constructed norms and values that we have. And that started to get me thinking much more about kind of race and racisms. And in kind of, I think in my late 20s, started reading a little bit of Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin. So it's very much an American kind of inroad to it, which was kind of like gave me, I suppose I felt like I started to begin to get a vocabulary and an understanding and a literacy about how to articulate and think about these things, because prior to reading them, I knew something was up. I'd heard some, like, I don't know, soft racisms from a family or community, but hadn't really been able to think deeply about it because I didn't feel like I had, I don't know, the vocabulary to do so. I don't just mean in terms of speaking, I mean thinking critically as well. And it was kind of those writers that gave me an insight into it. And then particularly now in the last, so I'm nearly 40 now, this was in my kind of mid to late 20s. In the last 10 years, I've really thought about being involved in healthcare and looking at the kind of sociology of racism. Because I've studied primarily a quantitative approach, very traditional empirical approach to things like sports science, exercise physiology. And it was devoid of any of this concept of kind of the social determinants of health and racism and all this sort of stuff. And I feel like now, I'm coming around to now being, almost trying to demonstrate a little bit that they aren't distinct things. You have to be interdisciplinary and you have to consider these other things. But obviously I'm different to Kay and Shona because I'm involved with facilitating workshops, so working with colleagues, BAME colleagues, people of colour, to talk about issues of whiteness and white supremacy, but I don't teach it on my programme. It's embedded in my programme, which can cause a lot of problems, but I don't teach it as a thing, if that makes sense.
It does. I think one of the things that all three of you mentioned is that there was an element of exposure that was necessary for you to be able to start doing that work of looking in and thinking of yourself as somebody that is racialized, particularly when you are in an environment where other aspects of your identity are noticeable or are named, or you can see the injustice that's happening because of that particular identity that you hold, whereas your racialized identity is normalized and doesn't have that level of exposure to it. For me, that's a really interesting point, because it makes me often think of when we talk about white allies, very often they are individuals who have either experienced some level of oppression themselves within a number of different types of systems, or they've had exposure to literature from people of color, or they've lived with people of color and been surrounded by them and have seen the experiences firsthand, and that has been a motivator for them to start the work. And then it makes me think maybe the people that are reluctant to start having conversations around whiteness is because there hasn't been that exposure.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, I don't, for me, I was never really exposed to those narratives. So that it was exposure to media. It was, I think if I think back to when I was kind of a teenager, it was I probably had a very much a kind of a sort of a colourblind or post-racial approach. We're all the same, nobody's different, etc. Which is not uncommon, is it? Particularly for white people who haven't experienced this. But it was exposure to texts and films, even though a lot of the films were quite obviously through a white gaze, which I wouldn't have been that aware of then at all, I don't think. But looking back, but that was still a platform to kind of want to find out more. I don't know.
Yeah, Shona, were you going to say something?
Well, I was, and I mean, I was thinking there was a couple of things. I can't remember what else I was thinking about in relation to Michael. So I'll come back in relation to what you were reflecting on there, because I don't know, right? I mean, I think one of the central issues for me now in the current moment, and that I've kind of been really thinking about over the last 4 or 5 years. So we've had a lot of texts, discussions, conversations that have been coming into the context of even as broad as the kind of mainstream, I think you could argue, if you think about somebody like D'Angelo, Reniero Lodge, but maybe we might be able to talk about the relationship between those two texts at some point. I don't want to do that now, but I think that actually there's a lot of space for white people to reflect on their racialization, actually, and I think how we do that, how we think about the reflective process is really important. And I think the other thing that this kind of does relate to what was springing to mind as Michael was talking, and actually this issue of exposure, because I think that's really complicated. I think we're all exposed to all sorts of knowledges all the time. What we see, how we see them, how we engage with them, the choices we make minute to moment are completely power saturated. And I don't think that we necessarily understand the relationship of the reflective process to that. So one of the things that very early on in my own work I started writing about was this difference between speaking about something and speaking through something. And I kind of generated that way of thinking about how people were engaging with, how the policymakers that I was doing work with were engaging with their own racialized, gendered, classed positions. And what can appear to be very self-reflective work actually can be a really very embedded form of defensive kind of mechanism, I think, around doing really the work. And I don't even know whether I like the notion of the work really, but let's let you know. So I don't know, I feel that's kind of, I feel complicated about all of those things. So I'll leave it there for the moment, unless you want me to, unless it wasn't.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That interests me a lot, I think, as a teacher. And one of the things that I've kind of experienced when I've worked with people who are talking about that whole thing about decolonising the curriculum and all of that, and that idea that by somehow introducing texts and resources is the end point, and we know that it's clearly, a very small part of like a massive whole, isn't it? And one of the things that interests me is how there's this concentration on kind of exposure to resources and exposure to text, but often without thinking about pedagogy. And I think that connects to your point, maybe Shona, about reflective processes. And I think it's this thing about actually what do you then do with that stuff, in order to kind of enact some kind of a change. And I know, I suppose from my own teaching, and this is conversations that I've had with colleagues and teams where I've worked and tried to do this, it's been very much about, well, what are you changing in your teaching practice, because it isn't enough to be bringing these things in. What are you doing about the pedagogy? So I think, and I'm not saying it's any kind of a solution, but I think the kind of things like philosophical inquiry and that kind of stuff that gets to a deeper critical level, reflective practice that's kind of reflexive practice, but also isn't seen as an individualized act either, because this stuff all happens communally, doesn't it? So things that really get people thinking about what it means to teach and do that in a critical way. That's certainly what was done for me, I think, and helped me get to maybe a slightly different place in my thinking. But I don't often see that talked about in the same way when you're thinking about, say, curriculum. I don't know what other people think about that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think one of the things from my understanding is that in order to do that deeper and critical reflection, to kind of engage in then subsequent action takes time, takes vulnerability, and these are vulnerabilities kind of the antithesis of some of the colonial kind of ways of thinking and being, right? So someone's got to be working on themselves to do that reflection, but they need to be, well, I don't know, we're talking the wider concepts of kind of getting colleagues to come with us, if you like, or whatever. But I've found that people often need scaffolding and support. They shouldn't have to, right? Because we're going back to what Kay says about power and everything else. We shouldn't have to wait. We shouldn't have to support. But for me, the reality is, working in higher education institutions, that people do need that scaffold, because they won't do, or they don't know that they're not doing necessarily, the deeper critical philosophical thinking that Shona was mentioning there.
I mean, I think I kind of agree with both of those aspects again, but I think for me it's so fundamental, living on under the terms of kind of racial capital and racial capitalism as it like frames us all, that it one of the things for me that's really important about race, and race as like a thing, is that it is a thing that's produced between us. And I think that for people who are racialized as white, there can be knowledge about that, like intellectual knowledge. There can be, I suppose, kind of a reflexive kind of internal thinking through of that. But I think what becomes very, very difficult to understand if you're white is that you are not a thing and anything outside of the racial dynamic. And I think that is so fundamental to, so I think what I'm kind of struggling with, and I struggle with this all the time, because we really, and the we there is those of us that are all situated under the terms of racial capital as like the way that we, or racial capitalism or coloniality, as the way we actually think, describe and talk about the world. So what you were saying, Michael, about vulnerability, like even the notion of vulnerability actually only makes sense in the context of a dynamic which understands vulnerability as something, or as us as beings that can be separate and separated. So power dynamics then that actually work and frame all of our activities day to day get really, really difficult to conceptualize as, you know, like if we look at the four of us and the conversation we're having, and that, you know, that is, or the three of us, or the four, you know, however we want to look at that, there's a dynamic that that operates within the context of the conversation. And I think that for like practical activities, so that like the stuff you were talking about, Kay, in terms of pedagogy and stuff like that, I mean, for me, it really puts into question the notion of pedagogy. Whiteness works as a form of pedagogy, as the pedagogy, if you like. So I think there's kind of like layers, and I don't really like talking about them in terms of layers, but let's do it for the purposes of today. But there's layers of kind of activity or engagements that need to be had in order to understand those relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, when I am really listening to what people who are racialized as not white, so black people, people of color, people in all sorts of different ways and different contexts, so those racializations might be different, but when I'm really kind of listening, trying to listen to what is being said about how race feels from a position that isn't a position of whiteness, I think that the experience of the world that isn't a white experience, I'm kind of losing my words. I think it is so embodied whiteness that the learning, that the unhabituation of just even moving in a particular way that frames people who are racialized outside of whiteness in a completely different way, and being attentive to that and kind of understanding that is something that isn't only about the classroom. It isn't even only about self-reflection. I mean, my dad, bless him, my dad was saying to me the other day, he's like, oh, I don't know what he'd been listening to, but he's like, it's about unlearning. It's what you talk about, Shona. And I'm like, yeah, you know, and it kind of was, and it was great. It was a really nice connection that he had, and it was kind of right. But the unlearning has to be bodily, you know, and I think that's really difficult for people who are white to understand, because the ocular, the relationship between what we imagine we see, what we feel, what we say, and what we're thinking is just not something that we're even used to kind of separating out. And starting, you know, in an undergraduate classroom with that as a starting point is like really probably, you know, that needs to be done in a different sort of way. but as people who are doing that work, we need to be able to do that if we're going to do it successfully, and to not expect anybody to think we're good, say we're good, congratulate us, or do anything like that. And I think there's another aspect to that maybe talk about later that really troubles me about how this work gets done sometimes.
So in another episode on this channel, we talked about what decolonizing actually looks like, and the idea that it's about dismantling and pulling things apart. And Shona, from what you said, it feels as though it's, once you pull things apart, looking at those pieces individually, but also recognizing that even those pieces that we pull apart, the idea of vulnerability, the idea of pedagogy, the idea of curriculum, we are always looking at it through a racialized lens, and we can't see them as being separate. This notion of whiteness, and it's one of the reasons why I really think your work around white spaces is so powerful, because very often we think of whiteness as something that is just about knowledge, and we don't think about it as embodied and felt and experienced within the space. And for people that are racialized as non-white, people of color, everything is embodied. So it's not just about epistemic oppression, it's about oppression in all its forms. And so whenever I think of the notion of whiteness and the work around whiteness, I always feel like it has to take a holistic approach and not be thought of just through the lens of this is systemic oppression, so therefore it's just about how we think of knowledge, but seeing it as the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree, but I'll let, you know, I want to hear what Michael and Kay have to say. I mean, you know, yeah, that really makes sense to me, what you say.
What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think it's one of the fundamental problems or issues to try and overcome is to try and understand things better. We have this, or often we have this kind of tendency, and it, again, embodied and embedded in whiteness, to break things down and want to look at things individually. But it's so interconnected that it does take a different way of looking at things. And, you know, I'm not sitting here, I'm not somebody who can do that, although I try. But it is an effort that we kind of have to make. I don't know, Kay, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, my experience, I suppose, thinking back to a previous role where I was interested not particularly in what had been done around decolonisation, but I was looking at the impact of the Why Is My Curriculum White campaign that had gone on in a particular university school. And what I suppose one of the things that was interesting was that thing about people not looking at the holistic picture and thinking again about maybe just curriculum, but then not thinking about the material nature of the university, and extending that idea of decolonising to thinking about buildings and thinking about the grounds, and, you know, thinking about everything from the mugs in the staff room, you know what I mean? It's kind of, people weren't thinking about it on that level at all. And how it is, yeah, very much just seen as a kind of cognition, as you say, rather than embodied in lived, self-replicating pattern. So I don't know whether that relates kind of to what you're saying, Muna.
Absolutely. And I was also, so I say it feels very strange to me in this particular episode, purely because in the other episodes I feel as though I'm very much embedded in the experiences of what everybody is sharing, whereas for this one I feel very privileged to be able to just observe it as an outsider. As I can't say I've done the work of doing anti-racist or anti-oppressive work as somebody who's racialized as white. And so I'm using this opportunity to ask you questions as a person of color that I've always wondered and I've been curious about. And I often think, and I say this to friends of mine who are white allies and activists that are doing this work, do you not get frustrated? Like, is there ever an element of frustration in doing this work? And how do you, not even just frustration, but what are the emotional responses that you have in doing this work? And how do you hold those emotions, but also how do you use them in the spaces that you find yourself working within?
It's a really good question, yeah.
Ooh. Well, I'll go. Do I find myself, did you say frustrated at first?
Yeah, and then I thought there'd probably be a multitude of emotions that you feel, but frustration is usually the one that I assume.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I mean, there's so many emotions coming up now. I'm allowed to. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think about the best way to answer this, because I also think one of the other things about white emotionality is it's always privileged, right? So
yeah.
that was kind of why I ended where I did when I can't even remember what I was talking about now, but I know I ended on the point that I was talking about not being liked for stuff. When, absolutely fundamental to whiteness is its imagination of its own goodness. And I think, again, this is one of these things that even the notion of the good is racialized. And again, for white people, it gets really difficult to understand that. Like, people just aren't being liked or loving comfort, the comfort that we experience every day, that I get to experience absolutely all of the time. That doesn't mean I don't get discomforted, but and I don't have pain and I don't have, whatever. But again, when you live under the terms of imperialism, that is racialized, and that this is why when people kind of say, oh, well, what about class, or what about this, or what about, and I'm like, no, race, the notion of race forms what it is to be human, right? So you get class, you get gender, you get sexuality through the notion of what constitutes race, and that fantasy. And so for me, the comfort of whiteness is to be comfortable in your humanity. So my frustration, my endless frustration with all aspects of the world and myself, is the constant surprise at discomfort or pain or whatever. And I'm kind of joking there, but I'm kind of not. So I think there's that. I think though, that's really, really fundamental, that we have to be able to just take, okay, I'm going to do the SHIT, I'm trying to be really good. We just have to, and that's people that are racialized as white, really have to just not be seen as being nice. You have to have people not like you for all sorts of reasons, be really angry with you and never actually even want to listen to you, which is kind of why, I mean, again, I'm really happy for this opportunity, but I also feel deeply discomforted. I'm doing it because you invited me, Muna, and I have so much respect for you, and I know the work that we're all doing is really important, but
can I jump in on a point there, Shona? Because so just when Shona mentioned about we need to be able to do the work and upset people and that sort of stuff. For me personally, that's kind of not a huge concern for me. I'm quite comfortable doing that because of my position, my positionality, my privileges, and I've got more leeway, if you like, to say certain things than BAME colleagues would, quite significantly female BAME colleagues, and that might be why I feel comfortable with that, because I've never had the repercussions of it ever, right? So, and I'm trying to use that as a for good, if you like. So for me personally, and that may be because of my gender and all the rest of it, it's not been a huge thing. However, what I have found is that in order to keep doing the work, you do have to be careful, at least when you're trying to commit to that change and activism in a university. So if you do keep upsetting the wrong people, you won't be able to do it anymore. So it's a concern of mine, but not for the same reasons. Everyone likes to be congratulated and liked, right? That's a human need. But it's more about, for me, is just being able to continue doing the work. And I've probably even come close on occasion to kind of being too disruptive. And that's, you know, in no way saying, well, look at me. That's, you know, I have been terrified about losing my job. And that's another way that capitalism works, right? So I think that's a key concern. And then just for me, in terms of Moon, and when you talked about the emotions that you go through, etc., again, like Shona says, I'm always, you know, very, very wary of talking about it, because it's a drop in the ocean compared to colleagues of colour who have to go through this. You know, they can't just drop it when they go home, right? Whereas I can walk out of a workshop and theoretically that could be it, right? So that's an incredible privilege. And any fear or anxiety I have is, as a white, racialized as white man, is kind of insignificant in that respect. But again, to balance that is that if part of our work is to be working in solidarity with others and helping other white activists join in this struggle, I think we also have to be honest about the experiences that they're going to have and they will have. And I think the key one is anxiety about when is the right time and place and opportunity to speak up, when is the right time to not speak up, what is the right thing to say. And when I talked about vulnerability earlier, it's kind of having that realization that you have to keep working at doing that. It's going to be incredibly an anxious time, and you will make missteps, but that doesn't mean you're ruining everything and that you shouldn't keep trying. You've got to kind of learn from those rather than just crumble, because like Shona says, this kind of like these capitalist ways, this competitive stuff, always wanting to be the best and be perfect and liked, that can really, you know, when you hit those inevitable hurdles where you're going to say the wrong thing and you're going to mess up when you thought you were doing a good thing, you need to be able to come back from that and understand that if people are critiquing you for that, it's ultimately coming from a place of love through probably several layers of frustration and everything else, but it's coming from that place. So I don't know if I went off a bit there, but
no. But before I go to Michael, can I just ask you? So you said, which I found really interesting, that you often find that you don't want to talk about the emotional response or the emotional effect of doing the work. Is that specifically with colleagues of colour, or is that at all? And the reason I say that is because a lot of the times when those of us that are people of colour that are doing the work, when we're with each other and we're working with white allies, I often find myself saying with the white allies that I work with, or the white activists that I work with, that from a human level and from a place of compassion, it's important to recognise and always respond to how you're feeling in that moment and emotionally how you're feeling in that moment. But at the same time, I often say to them, if you and I are working together, I can't carry the burden of your emotions as well as my own. So I always say to them, please find networks of support that you can go and speak to. But when you're talking to colleagues of colour, always bear in mind that because coloniality is relational, as soon as you share your emotional response, whether it's intentional or not, there is a response to it that we feel like we have to give. And especially in terms of white fragility, and we've talked about this countless times, Shona, that with white women in particular, there is a need often for people of colour to, especially women of colour, to comfort And it's like it's a response that has been so ingrained and we're conditioned to do, that even if it's a well-meaning place where you say it just as a matter of fact of, oh, I just want to say that this facilitating this workshop with you made me feel uncomfortable, but I'm okay with that. My response on a personal level is always, is there anything I can do next time to make it a little bit easier for you? And it changes the dynamic completely.
Yeah.
So I do think it's important to hold those emotional experiences, but who you share it with, it's just about being conscious of what that response is going to be as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the main crux of it, really. And it's why I think that in the reality of trying to do this work as a racialized as white person, you have to have a network of racialized as white colleagues or friends that get it, fundamentally get it. Absolutely. And that you can offload in, because again, it sounds ridiculous saying it because it is insignificant relatively speaking, but the reality is that it is fatiguing and there is stress and anxiety involved. But the only people really that you're sharing that with has to be your white colleagues, because as you say, it's relational and you are contributing, whether unknowingly or not, to more trauma, more labour, more harm, etc. So I think, that's a really important point.
Can I just say one thing? And I'm aware that Kay hasn't had a chance, so I'm going to try and... But this is kind of what I was trying to say around the body, because our bodies are communicating all of this stuff way before our mouths do, or our tears do, or whatever. And this is kind of what I was trying to say before about, like, George Yancey's work is absolutely brilliant on this.
Incredible,
and because he articulates, and actually Sarah Ahmed's work, actually, if you think about the example of the cockroach on the bus, she draws on Lord's work and she analyses that in a particular way. Our bodies, we have to work on this. Really, it's so kind of deep, but it is so externalized. And so I think I've got quite a hard line on it, actually, and maybe that's some of the maybe that's why I need to take breaks in my career, and I have taken breaks. But my hard line is you need to suck it up. I mean, for me, I'm like, you need to be ready to suck it up, really, and to work with others, but also to know that I also feel very uncomfortable about the idea of white people working on this stuff together for those reasons, because, we are born into racialization that runs so deep. So I think that certainly can't happen on its own.
Yeah, sorry, just to interject, I wouldn't suggest that at all in terms of just white people working on something. That's kind of the antithesis to what I was just saying, that there should be a network there where you can rely on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tough, all this stuff, isn't it? But anyway, I'll hand over to Kay, and kind of I'm interested to know what you think.
I think on the spaces and the sort of discussions, one of the things I found really invaluable is the Clear the Air network, the American network led by Val Brown, I think her stance is quite unusual in that it's very much about, it's that acknowledgement of pain, but also how can we get past this together? And it's sort of acknowledging a shared pain, which I think sounds a bit controversial really in the context of saying, when we think about the imbalance and the balance of power, but I find that really interesting. And I think for me, I guess I come from a slightly different position in that I'm really interested in that idea of kind of affirmative ethics. And actually that is very much about the recognition and very much the acknowledgement of pain, but then thinking about the getting past that. And I think personally, one of the things that I really struggle with, so this was the project that I worked on when I was looking at the why is my curriculum white stuff, was that kind of dilemma. And I've been reading Barbara Applebaum's work, I think, Being White, Being Good, was actually, it was those questions, should I be doing this? Why me? Why here? Why now? All of those kind of questions. And then thinking, well, if I don't, and maybe I shouldn't have done, maybe that wasn't my role as a white person. But this kind of thing about, you can, if you're not careful, you can just get very stuck, can't you, and get stuck in this position. And that's my dilemma, I think, very often is do I get stuck, and do I not do anything, do I not sort of move forward from that? So I think, yeah, I don't know, it's a really tricky one, and it is that ongoing dilemma. And as you say, Michael, if you don't have people that you can talk to and work that through with, you just end up, I think, in this position of kind of stasis, don't you, where you think, yeah, it's not the place for me, and actually maybe I should just walk away. And I think, going back to the sort of emotions and feelings and all of that kind of thing, and the embodied nature of that, the sort of recognition, and again, that kind of constant, the constant checking in with yourself, I think, is something that is helpful, but very much noticing, that idea of responsibility, and noticing on a bodily level what's kind of going on. I think that's often a gap that's kind of worth exploring. But I guess one other thing I suppose to say about that, and something that's been quite sort of, it's really formed a lot of my thinking, was some experience I had. This was in Canada a couple of years ago, working with some people on a conference about sort of indigeneity, and talking about restorative practices, and very much this idea about coming together to grieve together. That really interested me. And one of the examples given was, it was with a community that had experienced having their children taken away and schooled, and how they came together, white people and the Indigenous people who'd been affected by that. And they used, it was actually the tissues that they'd used to dry their tears. They gathered them together and had a ritual around that. So it's something really interesting for me about ritual and that knowledge of kind of shared experience. And I know that might sound a bit controversial. I don't know what you think about that, whether it's not about diminishing, but it's about restoring in some way.
Yeah.
Kay, well, I was just going to say, Kay, isn't that though? That's not a shared experience that pre-exists the action. I mean, I think this is it for me. It's about, we can create, and this is the hopefulness in, like, I'm not hopeful in terms of, I mean, although I'm like, oh, we need to suck it up, or we need to do what, I mean, I think that's an orientation to hope, frankly, in the current, in the context, we're in. And I think it is, again, the problem for me is this compartmentalisation, to come back to this issue of compartmentalisation, that shared experience is constructed. We are doing like this is a shared experience. We're not all experiencing it in the same way, quite obviously, but and there are multiple aspects of that experience. I can hear the guy outside. There's he's, I don't know, if he could see me, he'd have some sort of orientation to me. He has an orientation. I mean, there's all of, because of the multiplicities of life. And it's interesting thinking about, different ways of knowing the world, and that aren't white. I mean, this is it, this issue of epistemology, coming back to this issue, Muna, this epistemology and ontology, it's the splitting of epistemology and ontology through whiteness and through the notion of race, for me, like in my understanding, as a kind of thing that's in our bodies rather than something that's produced between us, which is the problem, but to get, or an aspect of the problem. But I am interested in thinking about or I think a lot about how to do that in interactions where not all of us, those of us in whatever interaction I'm in, have the sorts of starting points and the accesses so there's something about meeting people where they are as well. And I don't even know what I feel about that phrase really, but it's so well used, and it's helpful in some way, isn't it? Because I work in so many different contexts, and my work's engaged with in so many different contexts, and and I think that that's also very important for thinking about the liveness of anti-racist practice and how we do power. It can be doing power in a way that is potentially oppressive for others while doing something that is working very differently in another situation, but those things are going on at the same time. And I think that I'm always working with that, with the complexities of that. And that's like potentially really disempowering acts that you're part of because you're part of a collective thing. So, so sorry, I went on there, but
to your point, Shona, where you said about meeting people where they are, I often ask people as well to meet themselves where they are when you're interacting with people, because it is really relational. So for me, the question for you guys is, when you're engaging with colleagues that are both those that are racialized as non-white and those that are racialized as white, how do you navigate those interactions, particularly when there's resistance? So for those that are racialized as white, if there is resistance to the work that you're actually trying to do, and there's a level of willful ignorance or there's a level of ignorance, how do you meet them where they are? And when you're working with colleagues of color, how do you meet them and acknowledge where you are at in that particular kind of conversation as well? And how do you navigate any resistance that may come from them?
Can I be really annoying and just briefly return to something that Shona and Kay said before we tackle that question?
Of course.
So sorry, I didn't want to interject. Shona mentioned about kind of having to suck it up, and Kay was talking about affirmative ethics. And I just wanted to sort of say that notion of sucking it up as a white anti-racist accomplice is, there are layers to that. And the top layer, and the only layer that is actually really important, is the fact that, yes, you are privileged, own it, and you have to suck it up because you are not being oppressed here, no matter how you feel. And that's absolutely correct. But the reality is that there are layers to sucking it up. And the concept, for me, one of the things I take away from some of the critical Black feminist literature is this concept of reproducing these individualized kind of protective mechanisms that you've just got to get through. And I think if we're going away from those spaces to a support network and we're reproducing those same practices, I think that's problematic in itself. Now, that's not to say you can go and cry all your white tears and be given sympathy and everything else. Absolutely not. But if somebody does do that and they're not aware of it, then you'd hope that their white colleague would be saying, well, hold on a minute, I'm here to listen to that because I can take it, but actually take a step back because it's not appropriate for these reasons, and you can work through it. So what I'm saying is, yes, we absolutely suck it up, but I'm just wary of reproducing that in other areas, because there's just so much of this kind of hegemonic masculinity going on, particularly within academia as well, which I think we should be operating that in every sphere we're in. So I just wanted to sort of make that comment. Sorry for going backwards.
No, it's an important point.
Oh God, I don't know where to go now because I want to go back there.
Oh, sorry.
You can.
Well, oh gosh, but what you were asking about was, I kind of half lost it and gone. I mean, I think that's okay. I'll go back to what Michael was saying, and maybe it will come. Maybe you can remind us if we.
Yeah.
Because I just think that's. I think that is really important, actually. What Mike, that kind of teasing out of what that might mean and which context, the sucking it up or what have you. And part of that's also, that is very much my, personhood and my orientation. And actually, I'm pretty sure part of why I got very, very tired at one point. And actually, it does relate to this. That's reminded me, actually, Luna. And so that's about our different learnings, isn't it? So for me, remembering my own healthiness, like as a person and my own personhood, I think certainly has been very difficult for me over, for at different points. But I think that was about a problematic in my own political learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of it, and I think we haven't prized that apart. I mean, Michael, that what you're talking about there, and that's even from somebody that has been engaged around emotionality for kind of ever. I mean, that's kind of my interest. But so yeah, I want to shut up because I'm interested in it, but I really want to come back to this thing that you were asking, Muna, because I think
yeah.
So I think my question was just how do you navigate interactions with colleagues when there is resistance, and that could be with colleagues that are racialized in white or non-white identities.
I'm standing back now.
Me too, yeah.
I can say that you.
Kay, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do. I was just going to say my usual navigation is out of the organisation, unfortunately. Not always, not always by my choice. But Sarah Ahmed's work's been crucial in understanding some of this stuff. The project that I was talking about, where I was asking questions about people and their curriculum and their pedagogy, and sharing kind of my findings with colleagues was very painful. I think it was painful for me. It was painful for them. There was a lot of defensiveness, a lot of white fragility, a lot of denial, and all of those kind of things. But denial of things that were kind of laid out in front of them that were it was very hard for them to, I think, to deny, because it was there, on paper. So I think my usual stance, as I say, I do come from a place of affirmation, and I think when people are defensive and I'm wanting them to hear things that I want, that I want to tell them, I think there was that process of somehow scaffolding that, to make it not more palatable and not delivering the message, but trying to do it in a way that would open them up rather than shutting them down. Because I think very often, I've had this in the classroom as well, where there's been challenge and I've had to challenge a student, or another student has challenged them, and you can almost see the door shutting, can't you? And for me, there's this thing about trying to find the little window or the little chink of opportunity when there's that chance to get in there and think, this is my time to expand it and say those things. And I think the example that I'm giving, the organisation where I moved on, I think those opportunities were there, and I've seen that play out after I've gone, if you know what I mean, because people have carried on those conversations with me, and that's been really interesting, actually. And there are people that haven't wanted to do that quite clearly, but it took me, I suppose, about thinking, kind of going back to your point, Michael, what is the point if I'm going to have to walk away every time? What is that resolving? That could be doing more damage, actually. Thinking about my position, who am I helping here, actually? And coming back to that thing about the pat on the back for the white person, I'm sure I feel that stuff too. But I think, there's something about recognizing the moments. There's something about kind of not taking things personally and still being able to speak up and speak out. But I don't know what the answer is, really, and I can't say I've always done the right thing or done it well.
I think, again, this is one of the issues for me, actually, around kind of bouncing off what Kay was saying there, and a bit what we've kind of all circled around in terms of this: do we stay in an institutional space, or who should be doing the work, and all of this stuff. And I think I always come back to the work's always going on. It's always going on. I don't have to own that work. I don't need to be the person doing that work. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't take responsibility for doing this all the time. But I do think there's something about, so I get what you're, and I come, anybody who knows anything about my history, and I've written about this really openly, and I talk about it very explicitly, I have moved on from a number of institutional spaces and contexts, because it was the right thing to do. For all sorts of reasons, about me having finished whatever I thought I could do there, and there's lots of complexities around that. But I don't know that. I think, again, when I think about, so I talk about relational politics, like that's one of the key kind of terms that I've been using to think about how institutions work. And relational politics helps us to think about power dynamics and all of that sort of stuff. But what it helps me to do is to think about how an institution isn't what's going on in the present. So after having said we do our stuff in the present, like, I don't have to be, the world will continue wherever I'm not, or, you know, I think that for me is a really important part of anti-racist work, actually, or decolonial, actually, truly what I would think of as more decolonial work, because again, it resists a colonizing impulse. And I really think fundamentally, for, you know, if I think about whiteness and how it works, it is a relationship to ownership. You know, I mean, going back to somebody like Du Bois, in that really simple, you know, I have the world, basically, this is me badly paraphrasing him, forever and ever and ever. You know, that's it. That's what being white is, in a sense. It's that power to define and that power to do and that power to own, mixed with goodness, which then basically kind of splurges supremacy everywhere. And we all kind of, I don't know, that's, you know, that's kind of a really truncated way of thinking about it. But I think extended temporalities and extended spatialities help us to think about how our work is collective, even when we're not necessarily working together. And I think that's really important if we think about it. It's one of the issues I have with left politics generally, and I know that's massively various, you know, but so what am I saying? So I think it ain't that bad to move on. And that's not to minimise the power dynamics that you were talking about before though, Michael, I think. So we're all like, the position I have now, to me, would have been like unimaginable for, like, I think I'm probably the oldest here. but not by too long. Like my 43 years ago or whatever, you know. I'm in an incredibly, you know, probably get a sack tomorrow. No, an incredibly safe position in all sorts of ways, you know. But that safety is never, you know, it's only I don't know. I'll shut up now.
I think just coming off the end of what you're saying there, Shona, I totally get what you're saying. In the last 10 years, when I've gone to lots of different workshops, seminars, conferences, the strongest activism I see is from late career academics. And it's and this is not about you at all, it's just a general thing I've noticed. And even with all my privileges, obviously I'm not going to go into it now, but I don't have that luxury or safety net at all. I'm a single dad, got different things going on. So for me, it's a lot more complicated. And that's not to say that I don't take risks. They just have to be managed. I also agree with you in that, you know, if I go, you know, I'm not the all-seeing eye that's going to continue this work somewhere. The work will still go on. But I also think there's layers to that because, you know, I know that there's a department I've worked in before where I know that it's absolutely not going to be going on. And again, that's not my responsibility, is it? I'm not the kind of crusader, white saviour that's got to do all the work. But you do think about your students every day, and you do think about how many are not being centred and everything else. So that is an honest kind of reflection of mine. Again, I try to interrogate how much of that is me being the white guy going, well, if I'm not there, it's not going to be as good or whatever, you know, because that's something that I have to interrogate for sure, because that's implicit in this kind of whiteness, and it's so ingrained in us that it's got to be there somewhere, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but Muna, when you talked about, did you ask about kind of how we deal with the conflict of trying to deliver this stuff?
Yeah, just how your work is received by colleagues, because I know how difficult it is as being a minority member of staff in an academic institution trying to do this work, particularly when there are discourses like decolonising the curriculum that are being floated around everywhere. But when you're somebody who's doing this work meaningfully and you are racialized as white and talking to other white colleagues, How do you deal with some of the conflict that may come from that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's kind of an interpersonal level to this, and then kind of like a more overtly structural part. So interpersonally, there's kind of, Ignatiev's work on being a race traitor. I've certainly found that that's being perceived as a race traitor, and sometimes as a kind of, I don't know how you'd say it, maybe a masculinity traitor or a gender traitor as well. There are certain norms where if they do impact on the collegiality, which has kind of quite explicit impacts on kind of things to do with your career and your work, but also emotionally as well. That, does have an impact if you're going to go into that place of work every day. And that's quite significant. But in terms of, I've been engaging quite a lot of kind of, I don't know what you call it, staff development. And there always seems to be thirds in the audience. There are a third that are on their way to understanding it much better than I could anyway, and they're predominantly people of colour, and could tell me far more about it than I could ever do. There's another third who are sort of getting it, and they're really open to it, and start to get on board and start to understand it. And again, I'm not placing myself on a pedestal. Again, it's different things, whether it's about, what's the difference between race and ethnicity and all that sort of stuff, because we're not taught it at school, right? That's one of the things that was kind of hidden on purpose in the curriculum, right? This was prevented, from accessing. But then there's another third who, no matter what you say, and I don't want to be pessimistic or cynical here, but are really just going to get incredibly fragile, then incredibly rageful, and you're not really going to change them. So, but I suppose there's a couple of people in there. When I think back to when that happens, I kind of think in my head, well, I kind of know what you're going to say, and I kind of know how you're thinking because I've been there. Maybe not to the extent that they have, but I kind of know. I'm white, right? I went to a school where it was just ridiculously overt whiteness, absolutely ridiculous. And you kind of can then, if you know how their minds work and what they're going to say, you can then talk to them in a way that they're going to understand. And I found that quite helpful. So whether it's, well, this data is from America, it's not from the UK. Okay, well, here's the UK data, and let me explain it in this way. Or, hold on a minute, this is a new theory. Well, actually, no, it's not. Here's this, this, and this. And why do you think that particular way? What do you mean about why do I think? And so opening those questions out and talking and dealing with them as individuals, I found has been helpful. But like Kay says, it's also been incredibly problematic, and I've made mistakes with that before as well. So I don't know, all I can say is really, I mean, I've not been doing it as long, it's not even a decade really yet. We'll just come up for a decade, and it's a massive learning curve for me, without a doubt. But I do feel that I don't know if there aren't any upsides of being white, but there, in terms of, forgetting privilege or anything else, there's no goodness in terms of being white. But what there is that insight into what somebody's going to say next, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, I really appreciated your point about being strategic with this work as well, and it being necessary. And I often make the distinction between knowing what a situation is and saying that I'm going to use my privilege, but also being aware of what your spheres of influence are. And you may be somebody who is maybe defined as the epitome of privilege if you're a white middle-class man, for example, but you may not have sphere of influence within that particular space. And I think it's about acknowledging what your sphere of influence is at that particular moment and doing what you can within that space. And I think that comes with expectations as well. And realizing that this is something that's a long-term commitment. And so not saying I'm going to just burn all of these structures down right now because it needs to be done right now, and it coming at the cost of your well-being, your financial state, your family life, etc. But realizing that you're still doing the work, but you can't make some of the choices that you would probably be able to make further down the line. And
then, sorry, you've kind of taken the words out of my mouth, and I mentioned it being there's an interpersonal side and then a structural side, and that really ties in with that structural acknowledgement, really. But also on top of that is how does it work within your institution? who do you need to be working with and why? Who do you need to be supporting? And how is this going to work as an institution? Because pretty much, although I've sat on, helped, on a race equality charter team and all this and that and the other, a lot of what I've done has kind of been sort of, I suppose you'd call it grassroots. It's not been waiting for the institution to do something. It's been driving that from the bottom up, and you can only get so far with that, and it's incredibly frustrating. And you need to be able to understand the particulars of your institution. Or again, if you read some of Ahmed's work, it seems to be a common theme across institutions, but where does that fit in? So that kind of, community collaboration is a massive part of things. And
absolutely.
Can I, because I think I'd come at that from a bit of a different angle, you see. I think that's that I don't really experience that many colleagues, or, like when I'm speaking or what have you, people will be like, oh, yeah, what about class? What about, all the kind of classic stuff. And I've written a lot about working in institutions external to the university, kind of high level government stuff like that, where resistances can sometimes be the sorts of resistances to talking about whiteness that we are kind of talking about there. But I don't think the resistance to thinking about whiteness, the most insidious resistance, comes in that way, actually. From my experience, and in terms of the way I understand whiteness as working, it comes through basic institutional practices. Resistance doesn't demonstrate itself as, I'm not going to talk to you about, whiteness, or I'm not going to be with you. God, everyone's falling over themselves to be anti-racist or decolonial, or, I think resistance comes, and this is why the systemic nature of racialization and the fundamental nature of racialization is so important, I think, to my understanding, because I think resistance comes through the many back doors, if you like. You don't get invited to a meeting because people know that you won't be saying what they want you to say, or you don't get, I don't even want to talk, it's not even about me, I'm thinking that, it works in the same way, right? The values of the institution are white. They are white, as far as I'm concerned. The values of the institution I work in are white. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly revolutionary to say that. Therefore, the institutional practices will not forward anybody who is not embodying whiteness in the way that needs to happen. And I think that is a very, very hard thing for us all to kind of really start to get to grips with, actually. And that's not to say I don't love the place I work now, and I have worked in but that's what institutional whiteness is for me, really. So I think, and that's why the strategies, I really like all this stuff that's kind of coming out around the strategies. That's why the openness of the strategies are really important, because you have to start from there to be able to have a conversation with a black colleague, for example, about, right, okay, so we know this is going to happen, so which of us does what, and how does that shift this or that or the next thing, or I don't know. And I think I really like that stuff you were saying, Michael, about like grassroots. I feel ambivalent again about the notion of grassroots, but that it's daily practices that shift stuff. They're the only things that can shift stuff. That doesn't mean the overall narrative and the discourse, or however we want to think about a discourse, doesn't matter. But that's really, but I think this issue, I don't want to lose. I'm going to shut up now because I know Kay wants, I can see Kay's probably like, God, shut up. But I want to come back to this issue of resistance from black colleagues, because I think it's really important to talk about that. And we haven't yet, and I think it's interesting that slips.
No, I don't think I really had anything to add on that, other than, I suppose, thinking about just that issue with institutions as a whole. They're there to self-perpetuate, aren't they? You know what I mean? And I think that is a real that is a real challenge. I've gone a bit anti-organisation in recent years. I'm still employed by one, still work for one, but in my head, I'm really resisting attachment, actually. And I think that's partly due to past experiences, but because it is very much that self-interest within an organisation and the way that it constantly replicates all those manifestations of power. I have a real issue with that. And I think students as well. So not in the organisation I'm in now, but thinking of a previous institution which was very much built around student gratitude and practice of gratitude and the language of loyalty and all of that kind of stuff, which really was resistant to change, but also unhealthy on a whole number of levels, but also manifested or kind of tried to put itself out there as being empowering. So it's kind of, you know, that whole paradox about how you're empowering when you're tying people, chaining them in with this language of gratitude. So I have real issues, I think, with institutions. And I think you're right, Shona, that I don't think, you know, you can't do much on a macro level. And I think what I try and hold in my head is it is that idea of the minor gestures. It's the little shifts, the tiny shifts that you might even, they might even be imperceptible in a way, but it's those kind of holding on to those little minor gestures, those little changes, and those everyday, as you say, those everyday practices that might, you know, start to make shifts in one individual life, and that might then shift something else. I'm really interested in that, and the kind of informal nature of that happens outside of institutions and the learning that can happen outside institutions. So I think it's a constant kind of battle between the informal and the formal and the organisational and the sort of anti-organisation stuff.
I'm really interested in, sorry Shannon.
No, I'm listening.
No, I'm really interested in what you were saying about the institution, and I don't know if I was misunderstanding it, but when I talked about there's like an interpersonal and a structural, I think that we have to be talking about them both as being connected rather than these two different things. And maybe this is because, again, I'm thinking back to Mooney, the recent one with Jason that you did. I'm thinking back to that, but I'm thinking about how we have an accountability to try and make those connections between the interpersonal institution to try and get change. Now, maybe I'm naive because I've not been in it as long. When I say in it, you know, studying it, you know, delivering this stuff. But obviously there's some days where I think, wow, like Kay just said, you know, it's the small things and the different changes, and you're going to change your small corner of the world, right? And that's absolutely exactly what we have to do to stay sane, right? But I also think that we should be accountable to taking greater risks and to trying to change the institution. Now, whether that can happen or not, I don't know. And maybe, again, I'm being really naive. But I do think, and I don't know whether it's my kind of unionising mentality, if you like, but I do think that if enough people come together, we can make that change, even within an institution that is absolutely, you know, kind of self-replicating and you know, a vehicle of white supremacy, an engine and a fuel of it. Do you know what I mean? I do think that we have to be able to see the possibility of that and act to do it. But again, it kind of goes back to the master's tools type thing, doesn't it? Like, can we do it, and are we just going to be booted out for trying to do it? I don't know.
But I think that comes to, sorry, Mike, I think that comes to this redefinition of what constitutes an institution, which is what is so important for me, you see. So I don't really talk, oh my God, I'm just looking at what my hair's doing, sorry. It's like, oh God knows what state it'll be in by the time this is.
I was going to wear a cap today because I haven't been a barber for ages. But.
I know, I'm like, Leanne, my hairdresser, don't look at my hair. Okay, so obviously going slightly mad. Yeah, this is why I talk about the systemic nature of life, actually, but of racism more than I talk about structures, really. When I talk about structures, I'm talking about rethinking about how a structure happens, because I think this comes back to this thing about, so I think I think the notion of, I think a person can be an institution. I think the way we think about this stuff is about scale. And so for me, okay, so let me try and separate this out. So for me, that's why our own individual positionings are so important, because in a sense, the institution is nothing but us. You know, this conversation is nothing but us, but it has a frame which we imagine ourselves through, and which has a material impact on, you know, how we're viewing each other, how we're reading each other, how others are reading us. And so I think that, and this is this tension around, around responsibility working at the personal level when we only understand people as individuals. And this is like, still haven't listened to the whole of the conversation between Muna, Joe, Zainab and Jason, but Jason's articulation around individualism and how that is constitutive of neoliberalism and how that's constitutive of whiteness, really. That's me paraphrasing, I think, but that's why that's so important, because, and again, it's such a huge shift to understand that even though, like, I'm a person, I'm not like what we're doing now has an impact on the institutions we're all part of. Now, probably not a very big one, probably not. But if everybody in the institution was doing this, the institution wouldn't be what it is. But that's not it. But why I resist saying it's all about the individual or the personal is because how we narrativize that, like in our society, like in the context that we understand notions of the individual, that then gets reduced to, oh, well, as a person, I can just act like this, and then the world changes, and that's fine. Do you know what I mean? It gets simplified. So I think I'm with you in the, like that, our relationship to institutional practices is actually really close, but it's also very far, because it takes lots of people recognizing, like, the fantasy notion that we're all situated in. And that's kind of, you know, the toxic delusion of whiteness. That's a bit strong. We're all in it. Different.
So to return to the point that the question that you wanted to finish off, Shona, about how do you respond to colleagues when there's resistance? You rightly mentioned the fact that we didn't talk about when that resistance is coming from colleagues who are racialized as non-white. So how do you navigate those sorts of relationships, particularly when you are doing this particular type of work and presenting yourself as an ally or an activist, and they engage with you from a place of mistrust, which can often happen?
Oh, okay. So I don't know whether I'd present myself as an ally or an activist. but I don't know. That's because I have all sorts of kind of. But yeah, as somebody who's doing work on whiteness and on race, yeah, who is white, I'll claim that. Yeah, I think it's really complicated, because I think it depends on what resistance is, doesn't it? And it depends on where they're coming from. But I think this issue, because you raised it, I don't know whether I'd have quite put it in this way, but of mistrust, I think I take that really seriously. And I think actually I would have an expectation. Why on earth should any member of black staff in my institution trust me to not be part of what we're all in? You know, I just don't. And that's not to say that that's the only way people experience me, or maybe it's not even the way they experience, whatever, you know, but to not have that expectation of somebody who is in an institution which is white, who is white and who has power in that institutional space, no matter how constrained or complicated or whatever it is, I think they'd be kind of crazy not to just go, hey, hi lady, you know, yeah. So I think I just would take that seriously. That's not to romanticize the very serious disagreements and difficulties that I have with colleagues of colour around how to do anti-racist work, around all sorts, just around, I don't know, who likes what coffee and who nicked my coffee cup or whatever. You know, I mean, I think this is the thing, these relationships, because we're so racialised, our relationships become like either hyper whatever or not relationships. Claudia Rankin writes amazingly about this in Citizen. I'm not going to do the thing, I've started reading it to people. but about, so I don't know, I'll leave it there because I feel like I'm talking a lot. But
Michael, Kay, what about you?
Do you want to go first, Kay?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking slightly different, but I'm thinking more about my experiences with students actually, on this kind of similar issue, and situations I've been in the past, particularly on teacher training programs when I've been doing work around equalities and things like that. And to be honest, there's an issue with the teacher education curriculum, I think, generally, because this stuff doesn't tend to get addressed. Or, you know, Michael, we've had these conversations before. And there's been that challenge where it's been, I've had it quite a number of times where a student of colour might have said something like, why are we talking about this? Because it's never been an issue for me if we're talking about dealing with racist incidents or things like that. Or why do you have to bring this into the curriculum because that isn't a standard text, and you know, and those kind of challenges that have come back. And I don't know the answer. I've got to be honest. It's made me feel, sorry to go straight to my feelings about it, but it's made me think, yeah, should I not have done that? You know, should I not have done it in that way? Should I have done it with a group of white students? And should I have not done it where there's maybe just one or two students of colour in the class? Or have I opened up a can of worms here that's now going to cause pain, you know? And that wasn't my position to do that. Well, you know, and so all of those kind of questions I think has been raised by it. So an experience on a curriculum that I used to teach a few years ago, I came into the post, it was leading a teaching and learning curriculum, and the curriculum was entirely, the resources were entirely white theorists, as you often find on teacher ed. And so I was obviously wanting to change that and do some thinking around the teaching, and the challenges were sort of coming from all fronts actually on that. And I carried on, of course I did, because it's, you know, on a whole number of levels you have to do that. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to see what...
Well, I think we've lost.
Yeah.
We lost Kay.
Oh, the audio went off, Kay. Michael, do you want to share your?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to come back to what Kay said about students, but first of all, what Shona was saying about colleagues, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think part of doing this work and being racialized as white is understanding that you may never get that trust. You certainly don't deserve that trust and should not expect it, and it shouldn't be something that is an obstacle for you to do the work. I think on a just purely looking at, and this is a, you know, the problem with humanism, if you like, on a human level, absolutely, you know, you would have to process the feelings of, well, come on, we're humans and we're working together and I'm absolutely trustworthy and all the rest of it. But it would be absurd to trust somebody like me. It would be absurd given the nature of white supremacy. So it's absolutely normal and to be expected. It doesn't make it easy, but it's one of those things that just is. So yeah, I think there's that element of trust. I think that we also have to acknowledge that, you know, there's so many times I've felt like a big fish in a small pond, where I've been rewarded for something that might have been actually detrimental to a colleague of colour doing exactly the same thing. Someone will pat me on the back for asking a question to the VC in a public forum, and that somebody else would be absolutely, you know, if not bodily removed, they would be, you know, ostracised for it. So, and I think expecting colleagues of colour to process that as an observer is something that we have to acknowledge as well, because yeah, I just think that's a thing we have to be conscious of, if you like. In terms of navigating, as I said, I think from my experience, time and action have been the things that have built that trust. But there's still no expectations there with it, and it's not trust in and of itself. If we go back to what we're talking about, when Mooney said, you know, colleagues have mentioned X, Y, or Z, that doesn't mean you can suddenly start talking about X, Y, or Z. It means you're in a very, very privileged position where the solidarity you're experiencing, for me personally, has been something that I've had to process, because I've never, again, this is part of Whiteness, I think, had that sense of solidarity where people get you and you get them, is something that I hadn't really experienced before. Maybe that's just me, but and that's something to be very, very thankful for and respectful of. I think in terms of students, what's been helpful for me, I think, is to think, not in a patronising way, but when doing staff development, is to really explicitly think of colleagues like I would think of students. And I don't mean, it's not a power difference, because that's what we're trying to break down and get away from and dismantle in terms with our students, but it is an acknowledgement that there are journeys involved and there are lived experiences and everything else. And I don't know the answer to that. I'll do a quick plug for Moona's How to Be a White Ally here, because I've referenced it very recently in a chapter I'm writing, and I think it's absolutely helpful for people like us who are trying to act in solidarity. So those, your kind of tips, if you like, as a starting point to say, hey, be conscious of these things, I think is really, really helpful. Mm-hmm. I think when I've made mistakes in the past, I think when with students of colour, perhaps, and I think for me, because I don't teach what you teach, so just an example, I teach about pain. So physical, what you would probably understand as physical pain. So a patient will come to see somebody and they will say, I've got an issue and it's pain. So I teach them about what is pain, the history of pain, the social, cultural, gendered, race origins of pain, science, and all the rest of it. And I think giving students a heads up that we're going to talk about that is really important. I think stating from the outset, following some of the stuff, the building the anti-racist classroom stuff, so giving a heads up about what the expectations are in that space, so that it gives students the option of preparing themselves, removing themselves, etc. I think is probably a practical thing that is helpful. But the nature of it is, I think back when I started doing it, it would surprise me if there was a student of colour who would have been like, what are you doing? Because that, in my naivety, that was a surprise to me. So, and again, processing that, well, it's not a homogenous group, so of course that's not going to be the case, right? But your whiteness kind of blinds you to that initially, what it did for me. So working through that is important, and so I think that's helped with students. But again, I come at it probably from a slightly different, practical aspect, because it's not a standalone thing in what I teach. I'm trying to show how it's embedded, and that is difficult sometimes. And I have had colleagues say, in the past, not necessarily where I am now, but I'm absolutely not talking about this. You're forcing your ideology on me, etc. That tends not to be colleagues of colour, of course, but that does happen. But again, when colleagues of colour have said perhaps things like, but I've never experienced that in my 40 years in academia. I just worked really, really hard. And if everybody works hard, everything's okay. And it's kind of, that's why, going back to what you said, Shona, earlier on about, trying to, any of this work is done in collaboration. I think that is really helpful when you have colleagues with different ethnicities and racialized differently can come together and support each other in those kind of contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I say something as well about that, the student thing? Because I think that's really interesting, actually. It kind of sparked a lot of kind of reflections about my last kind of context I was in. But this is just to kind of clarify, maybe, when I'm invited to speak, and when I've been invited to speak elsewhere, I've largely been invited to speak about either power or whiteness. Tends not to be in the UK when I'm being asked to teach it. I've actually never, until now, been allowed, and I think it was allowed very explicitly, disallowed from teaching about race. what I've always taught about is institutions, institutional life, institutional politics, policy making. That's like the bread and butter of all. I was allowed to teach about emotions eventually, which was all. But so I think what you're saying, Michael's really interesting, because I really identify with aspects of that. But it's interesting because I think maybe because you're a better teacher than me, or a more careful teacher than me, or maybe because it was earlier. Let me be nice to myself. I don't know. But I taught my courses as though they were about culture of the institution. Because for me that culture was one of imperialism and racial capitalism. So but I remember at Leeds particularly, the kind of undergraduate students were like, wow, we didn't know we were coming to this is kind of a weird way of doing institutional work. Okay, let's go for it. No, but there were real difficulties as well. And it's interesting, I was thinking about, I had to make some kind of calls around resistance from some black students, actually, not many, but that was partly about the context of the institution I was working in, of Leeds University, and its student body, and the student body of the school that I was working in at the time. But I think I kind of made a judgment call that my analysis of the world, and the reason that I'm employed here, and the reason that I write and all of this stuff is through the lens of kind of anti-imperialism, decoloniality, kind of cultures, power, and that knowledge is what I am here to engage the students with. So I need to be careful about it, and I need to think about it. But thinking about what you were saying, Kay, about should I open that up, or should I think in the end that's all we can do. We can't not. I mean, I think we need to be really careful about how we do it, but and I don't know the teaching context you were talking about, like your examples either, so there's something about that, isn't there? But where do you get this stuff? You probably won't get it in the university for much longer, frankly, if you get it all. I don't know.
Yeah. So we could carry on this conversation for a very, very long time, but just to draw it to a close, I really just want to invite the three of you to share your reflections. So any final reflections that you want to share before we finish off the conversation? Kay, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for bringing this together. And what's burning in me right now is how much I still have to learn, actually. How much I still have to read and think about and reflect on. And I know that journey kind of never ends, but it's sort of thrown open for me how little my scheme of knowledge, I think, around all of this is. So thank you.
Do you want me to go? I'm the same. I'm like, thank you. I'm like, thank you for bringing me out of my pit. It's been really, really nice. I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed learning and hearing, from Kay and Michael. And I mean, I think that's probably it. That I've got lots of processing. I always have a stand back, so I'll reflect. And brilliant. Thank you. It's long as well. The time.
Michael?
Yeah, I'll just echo what they've said there, and just extend a massive thanks. I think it was really important for me when you invited us to do this, to kind of know where you were coming from, and to know that having listened to and watched a couple of the previous ones, that it's coming from a place of authentic struggle and for want of a better word, diversity, right? Not in the kind of faux multicultural sense, but in the authentic sense, right? Because it's important that we're not just occupying more space talking about issues of whiteness from white people. So I really value what you're doing, and that you invited us to do this. And I'm also just learning from all of you. So I would say thank you for that as well, really.
Brilliant. And I would just finish off by thanking the three of you as well. I've learned a lot. And when I set up the channel, I knew I couldn't talk about decolonizing without at some point having to talk about whiteness, and it made sense to bring in not just white people that are aware of whiteness, but people that are doing meaningful work and that recognize that it is a struggle and that there are tensions to do in the work. And I've been following the work of you three for so long. So thank you so much for spending the time to talk to me.
Thank you.
A big love in.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.